Tea, Murder, Whisper. Tonight's story begins, but before we dive in, thank you for being here with us. I'm your host, Edward, and isn't it wonderful how these mysteries bring us together from all corners of the world? Leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's begin the mystery. The afternoon sun slanted through the drawing room windows of Rosebank Cottage, casting cheerful squares of light across the chintz-covered chairs and well-polished mahogany. Mrs. Rowena Glade moved about her parlour with the practised efficiency of a hostess who had spent years perfecting the art of the charity tea. At 42, she possessed the kind of understated elegance that spoke of good breeding rather than mere wealth, her dark hair swept into a neat chignon, her grey silk dress impeccably cut but not ostentatious. "Now then, ladies," she called to the assembled members of the Women's Institute, "do remember that each pledge call should be answered with enthusiasm. Mrs. Pemberton has kindly agreed to man the telephone in the hall, and we shall pass along the good news as whispers through the parlour. It adds such a delightful element of anticipation, don't you think?" Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner chair with her knitting bag at her feet, observed the proceedings with bright, interested eyes. She had arrived early, as was her custom, and had watched with quiet attention as Mrs. Glade arranged and rearranged the furniture until everything met her exacting standards. The balloon-backed chair near the hearth had been moved twice, she noticed, until it sat at precisely the right angle to catch both the warmth of the fire and the light from the window. "Such a clever idea, Rowena," declared Lady Bantry, resplendent in purple tweed that would have looked garish on anyone with less confidence. Dolly, to her friends, she had the sort of comfortable presence that made even the stuffiest committee meeting feel like a gathering of old companions. "Though I do hope the speaking tube still works properly. These old houses have such amusing features." Mrs. Glade's smile was perhaps a shade too bright. "Oh yes, it works perfectly well. The girls tested it earlier, didn't you, my dears?" Two young women from the village, recruited to help serve tea, giggled and nodded. One of them, a rosy-cheeked girl named Betty, had fashioned a paper funnel and stuck it into the parlour end of the old speaking tube that connected the drawing-room to the pantry below. "You can hear ever so clearly," she announced. "Mrs. Glade said we might use it to pass along the whispers if the room gets too noisy." The guest of honour arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, as befitted a man of his position and temperament. Mr. Lionel Pargeter was the sort of gentleman who commanded attention without seeming to demand it, his robust frame filling his well-tailored suit, his grey moustache waxed to perfection. As chairman of the Village Appeal Fund and senior partner at Pargeter, Wickham and Associates, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to deference. "Ladies, ladies," he boomed as he entered, removing his bowler hat with a flourish. "What a delightful gathering. Mrs. Glade, you have outdone yourself once again." Mrs. Dulcie Trent, the WI treasurer and a woman who took her responsibilities with military seriousness, rose from her position at the small writing desk where she had arranged her pledge sheets in precise rows. "Mr. Pargeter, how good of you to join us. I believe we shall have excellent news to share with you by the end of the afternoon." A slight commotion in the doorway announced the arrival of Maurice Dean, the village's cabinet-maker turned antique restorer. He was a lean man in his 50s, with the careful hands and keen eye of one who made his living understanding the weaknesses of wood and glue. His deference to the assembled ladies was marked, though Miss Marple noticed how his gaze lingered on Mrs. Glade with something more than professional interest. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, cap in hand. "I only wanted to assure Mr. Pargeter that I've examined all the chairs as requested. Everything is quite sound." "Splendid, splendid," Pargeter replied, settling himself into the balloon-backed chair that Mrs. Glade indicated with a graceful gesture. "Can't have the committee falling about, can we? Though I must say these Victorian pieces do have their mysteries. This one creaks in the most amusing fashion." He demonstrated by leaning back slightly, and indeed the chair produced a small protesting sound from its back left leg. "Nothing to worry about, I'm sure," he added with a hearty laugh. Mrs. Hilda Sims, the daily maid whose practical nature made her invaluable to Mrs. Glade, emerged from the pantry below carrying a tea tray laden with the finest china. Her movements were efficient and unobtrusive, the sort of service that seemed to accomplish itself without drawing attention to the server. "Tea, Mr. Pargeter?" Mrs. Glade inquired, positioning a small side table to his right with practised precision. "I remember you prefer it without sugar, on doctor's orders." "Quite right. Quite right. Though I confess I do miss it sometimes." He accepted the cup and saucer with evident pleasure, his large hands making the delicate china seem almost toy-like. The afternoon proceeded with the gentle rhythm of such occasions. Mrs. Pemberton's voice could be heard in the hall, enthusiastically soliciting pledges from the village worthies, while the ladies in the parlour bent over their needlework and maintained the sort of conversation that seemed to say nothing while revealing everything. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she worked on a baby's booty, her eyes moving occasionally from her knitting to observe the small dramas playing out around her. There was something in the atmosphere, a tension that she could not quite identify. Mrs. Glade's laugh came perhaps too quickly, and Mr. Dean's attention seemed oddly focused on the various pieces of furniture rather than the conversation. "3 guineas from Major West," came a triumphant whisper from the direction of the speaking tube, passed along by one of the serving girls. Mr. Pargeter leaned back in his chair to share in the general laughter, his right hand gesturing expansively with his teacup. "Excellent! Excellent!" The Major always comes through when. The words were cut short by a sharp crack. The balloon-back chair tilted suddenly backward, its occupant thrown off balance. Mr. Pargeter's head struck the brass fender with a sound that silenced every conversation in the room. His teacup flew from his hand, its contents spattering across the carpet in a wide arc. For a moment nobody moved. Then Mrs. Glade's scream shattered the silence, and the parlour erupted into activity. Miss Marple, rising quickly from her chair despite her years, was among the first to reach the fallen man. As the others crowded around, calling for Dr. Haydock, and generally creating the sort of helpful confusion that accompanies any emergency, she found herself kneeling by the skirting board where the spilled tea had pooled. Her fingertip touched the dampness, then lifted to her lips for the briefest instant. The others were too distracted to notice, but Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful indeed. She tasted sugar, but Mr. Pargeter, as everyone knew, took no sugar in his tea. Chapter 2, The Chair Tips. Dr. Haydock arrived with the breathless haste of a man summoned from his afternoon surgery, his black bag clutched firmly in one hand. The parlour had fallen into that peculiar hush that follows sudden tragedy, broken only by Mrs. Glade's muffled sobs and the sound of Hilda Sims efficiently clearing away the scattered china. "Stand back, please, ladies," the doctor commanded, his professional manner brooking no argument. He knelt beside Mr. Pargeter's motionless form, his experienced hands moving with practised certainty. After what seemed an eternity but was perhaps only minutes, he sat back on his heels with a heavy sigh. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he announced quietly. "The blow to the temple was quite severe. Death would have been instantaneous." A collective gasp arose from the assembled women. Lady Bantry sank into the nearest chair, her face pale beneath her carefully applied rouge. But surely it was just an accident. The poor man simply fell backwards when his chair gave way. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, summoned by Dr. Haydock's telephone call. He was a solid, methodical man whose competence was sometimes obscured by his tendency towards hasty conclusions. Miss Marple had encountered him before, and she watched now with interest as he surveyed the scene with the air of one who had already formed his preliminary judgment. "Right then," he announced, consulting his notebook with official importance. "Dr. Haydock says accidental death, head injury from the fall. Straightforward enough, I'd say. Bad luck with the furniture, but these old pieces can be treacherous." He approached the overturned chair with the confidence of experience, his heavy boots echoing on the polished floor. The balloon-back chair lay on its side, one leg detached completely from the frame. Slack crouched down to examine it more closely, his weathered hands turning the pieces this way and that. "Well now, that's peculiar," he muttered, his brows drawing together. This tenon here has pulled clean out of its socket. Sharp break too, not the sort of gradual failure you'd expect from old wood. Maurice Dean, who had remained in the parlour despite Mrs. Glade's suggestion that the gentleman might prefer to wait in the morning room, stepped forward with an air of professional concern. "May I have a look, Inspector? I did examine these chairs just last week at Mrs. Glade's request." Slack handed him the detached leg, watching as the craftsman's practised eye assessed the damage. Dean turned the piece slowly, his fingers tracing the clean break where the tenon had separated from the mortise. "The wood itself is sound enough," he pronounced after a thorough examination. "But Victorian glue can be unpredictable. After 60 years or more, the animal glue simply gives up, especially in variable temperatures. I've seen it happen before, quite suddenly." Miss Marple had been standing quietly near the window, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Now she moved closer to the group clustered around the broken chair, her keen eyes taking in details that others might miss. "Mr. Dean, you said you examined all the chairs last week. Did you notice any particular weakness in this one?" The cabinet maker's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Well, there might have been a hairline crack in the joint, but nothing that suggested immediate danger. These old pieces often have small flaws that can last for decades without causing problems." Inspector Slack nodded sagely, making notes in his book. "There you have it then. Old furniture, old glue, unfortunate timing. Could have happened to anyone sitting in that particular chair." Mrs. Glade, who had composed herself with visible effort, dabbed at her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. "I feel so terribly responsible. If only I had known there was any risk, I would never have placed Mr. Pargeter in that chair. He was our guest of honour after all." Now, my dear," soothed Mrs. Trent, patting her hostess's arm with brisk sympathy. "You could hardly have foreseen such a thing. Who among us would think to test every chair before seating our guests?" Miss Marple found herself studying the scene with growing interest. Something about the arrangement troubled her, though she could not immediately identify what it might be. The chair had been positioned just so, the small side table placed within easy reach of the occupant's right hand, the brass fender gleaming in its proper place before the hearth. "Inspector Slack," she ventured gently, "might I point out something rather curious?" The inspector looked up from his notebook with the patient expression of one who had learned, through sometimes painful experience, to listen to Miss Marple's observations. "What's that then, miss?" She gestured towards the overturned chair and the scattered remains of Mr. Pargeter's afternoon tea. "I couldn't help but notice that there are 2 teaspoons on his saucer. Most gentlemen use only one, do they not?" Slack bent to examine the china more closely. Indeed, 2 silver teaspoons lay beside the delicate cup, both showing signs of recent use. "Odd," he admitted. "Can't think why a man would need 2 spoons for a cup of tea." Mrs. Trent looked up from her position beside Mrs. Glade. "Oh, that would be my fault, I'm afraid. When I served Mr. Pargeter his second scone, I provided a fresh spoon for the jam. He was rather particular about such things, you know. Didn't care to use the same spoon for stirring his tea and spreading his preserves." "Fussy sort of fellow, was he?" Slack observed, making another note. "Not fussy exactly," Mrs. Trent replied thoughtfully, "but he did have his little habits. He always stirred his tea twice, for instance, even when it contained no sugar. Claimed it helped to cool it to just the right temperature." Miss Marple's attention had wandered to the skirting board near where the chair had stood. The afternoon light, now slanting at a different angle, caught something that glittered faintly against the dark wood. She bent down with some difficulty, her arthritis protesting the movement, and touched the spot delicately with one finger. When she straightened, her fingertip bore a few tiny crystalline grains that sparkled in the lamplight. She examined them closely, then tasted them with the tip of her tongue. "How very strange," she murmured, though her voice carried clearly in the quiet room. "What's strange, Miss Marple?" asked Dr. Haydock, who had been completing his preliminary examination. "Sugar," she replied simply. "There are sugar crystals here by the skirting board, and some sort of sticky residue as well. Yet Mr. Pargeter took no sugar in his tea, as we all observed." The assembled company turned to stare at the spot she indicated. Indeed, in the proper light, A faint sparkle was visible against the dark wood, and what appeared to be the dried remains of some sweet substance. Inspector Slack scratched his head. Could be anything, I suppose. Perhaps one of the serving girls spilled something earlier? But Miss Marple was examining the underside of the broken chair with renewed interest. Along the back rail, just visible if one knew where to look, was a pale tide mark that spoke of recent moisture. Mr. Pargeter did spill his tea when the chair tipped, observed Lady Bantry. I saw the cup fly from his hand quite clearly. Yes, agreed Miss Marple thoughtfully, but the spill pattern suggests the liquid came from somewhere else entirely. Most curious indeed. Hilda Sims, who had been quietly gathering the scattered tea things, looked up from her work. Begging your pardon, miss, but I did have to wipe up a little slop earlier. Mr. Pargeter laughed rather heartily at something and wagged his cup about. Gentlemen will do that, you know, when they're making a point. And when was this? Asked Miss Marple with gentle interest. Just before the accident, miss. Right after one of the girls called out about Major West's pledge. Mr. Pargeter was leaning back to share in the laughter when his chair gave way. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her bright eyes thoughtful. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to present themselves, though their proper arrangement remained frustratingly elusive. Sugar where no sugar should be, 2 spoons where one would suffice, and a chair that failed with suspicious precision. Most illuminating, she murmured to herself, quite unaware that Inspector Slack was watching her with a mixture of resignation and curiosity. The inspector had learned to recognise that particular expression on Miss Marple's face, and it invariably meant that his simple accident was about to become considerably more complicated. Chapter 3. Sugar on the Skirting. The late afternoon shadows had begun to lengthen across the carpet of Rosebank Cottage's drawing room when Miss Marple made a request. The removal of poor Mr. Pargeter's remains had been accomplished with as much dignity as such circumstances allowed, leaving behind only the overturned chair and the lingering sense of tragedy that seems to permeate a room where sudden death has visited. Lady Bantry, Miss Marple said quietly, might I impose upon your patience for just a few minutes more? I should very much like to show you something rather puzzling. Dolly Bantry, who had been preparing to take her leave, settled back into her chair with the expression of one who recognised the signs. She had witnessed Miss Marple's particular brand of curiosity before, and had learned to respect the elderly spinster's observations, however unlikely they might initially appear. Of course, Jane, she replied, though I confess I'm not sure what more there is to see. Poor Lionel's accident seems tragically straightforward. Inspector Slack, overhearing this exchange, approached with the weary resignation of a man who suspected his simple case was about to become decidedly less simple. Now then, Miss Marple, I hope you're not about to complicate matters unnecessarily. Sometimes an accident is just an accident. Miss Marple smiled with gentle patience, the sort of expression she might have worn while explaining a simple sum to a particularly stubborn child. Oh, I quite agree, Inspector. But you must admit that some accidents do present rather curious features when examined closely. She moved towards the skirting board where she had earlier discovered the sugar crystals, her movements careful but purposeful. The afternoon light had shifted enough to illuminate the area more clearly, revealing details that had been obscured during the initial confusion. If you would be so kind as to look here, she continued, pointing to the spot where the wall met the floor, you will observe not merely the sugar crystals we noted earlier, but something rather more interesting. Lady Bantry knelt beside her friend, her purple tweed making a sharp contrast against the darker wood of the skirting. Good heavens, Jane, you're absolutely right. There's a definite pattern to it, isn't there? Indeed, when viewed from the proper angle, the sugar crystals formed a distinct line along the skirting board, as if some sweet liquid had run down the wall and dried in place. The sticky residue Miss Marple had first discovered extended for several inches, creating what could only be described as a tide mark of crystallised sweetness. Most peculiar, observed Dr. Haydock, who had remained to complete his official duties. That pattern suggests a considerable quantity of liquid containing dissolved sugar, far more than one would expect from a simple tea spillage. Mrs. Glade, who had been sitting quietly in the corner with her handkerchief pressed to her eyes, looked up with an expression of bewildered concern. "I simply cannot understand it. We serve only the finest tea, and as everyone knows, Mr. Pargeter never took sugar." Dr. Haydock had been most specific about his dietary restrictions. "That is precisely what makes this so intriguing," Miss Marple replied, rising from her examination of the skirting board. "The sugar is definitely present, yet it did not come from Mr. Pargeter's tea. We must therefore ask ourselves where it did originate." She moved to the broken chair, which still lay on its side where Inspector Slack had left it after his examination. With surprising agility for her years, she crouched down to examine the underside of the seat and back rail. "Lady Bantry, if you would be so good as to look at this back rail here, you will notice a very distinct watermark. See how the wood has been stained in a horizontal line? That suggests that liquid ran along the rail and dripped down to the skirting board below." Dolly Bantry adjusted her spectacles and peered where Miss Marple indicated. "You're quite right, Jane. There's definitely been liquid here, and recently too, judging by the clarity of the mark." Inspector Slack, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, cleared his throat officiously. "Now see here, Miss Marple, you're making this far more complicated than it needs to be, so there was a bit of spillage before the accident. These things happen at tea parties." "Indeed they do," agreed Miss Marple pleasantly. "But the question remains, what exactly was spilled, and when?" She turned to Hilda Sims, who had been quietly gathering the last of the tea things onto her tray. "Hilda, you mentioned that you had to wipe up some spillage earlier. Could you tell us precisely what you observed?" The maid set down her tray and considered the question carefully. Hilda Sims was the sort of woman who took pride in noticing details, particularly those related to the proper maintenance of a household. "Well, miss, it was just after the young ladies called out about Major West's pledge. Mr. Pargeter was laughing and gesturing with his teacup, as gentlemen will do when they're animated about something. He wagged it about quite vigorously, and I saw a bit of liquid splash out." "And where exactly did this liquid land?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "On the chair rail, miss, just where you've been looking. I noticed it particularly because I'd given that chair such a thorough polishing yesterday. The liquid ran right along the wood and dripped down to the floor. Most observant of you, Hilda. And what did you use to clean it up?" "Just my cloth, miss, though I must say it left the wood feeling rather sticky, which struck me as odd since Mr. Pargeter's tea contained no sugar." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. "Sticky, you said? That is indeed curious. Tea without sugar should not leave any residue of that nature." Mrs. Trent, who had been following the conversation with growing fascination, leaned forward in her chair. "But surely someone else might have had sugared tea earlier. Perhaps one of the serving girls spilled something while preparing the refreshments." "An excellent suggestion," replied Miss Marple. "Betty Mary, did either of you spill anything sugary in this area during your preparations?" The two young women who had been standing quietly near the door exchanged glances before shaking their heads. Betty, the more talkative of the two, spoke up. "No, miss. We were ever so careful with everything. Mrs. Glade had stressed how important it was that everything be perfect for Mr. Pargeter's visit, and none of the other guests take sugar in quantities that would create such extensive spillage." Lady Bantry considered this carefully. "I take one lump, as does Mrs. Trent. Mrs. Glade takes hers with lemon, and you prefer yours plain, Jane. Certainly none of us would create such a mess." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze moving from the stained chair rail to the crystallized sugar on the skirting board and back again. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though its significance remained tantalizingly just beyond reach. "There is another curious detail," she continued, approaching the small side table that had been positioned beside Mr. Pargeter's chair. "This table was placed very precisely, was it not, Mrs. Glade? Just within easy reach of his right hand?" Mrs. Glade nodded, dabbing once more at her eyes. "Yes, I always take care with such arrangements. Mr. Pargeter was right-handed, and I wanted him to be comfortable." Most thoughtful. "And yet the spillage we observed occurred on his right side, precisely where he would naturally gesture with his cup, almost as if someone had anticipated exactly how he would move." The room fell silent at this observation. Inspector Slack's expression suggested he was beginning to realise that his straightforward accident might be considerably more complex than he had initially supposed. "Now, Miss Marple," he said with forced heartiness, "you're not suggesting that someone deliberately arranged for Mr. Pargeter to spill his tea, are you? That would be taking things a bit far." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp with intelligence. "I am merely observing, Inspector, that there are several curious coincidences in this affair. Sugar where no sugar should be, spillage that leaves sticky residue despite containing no sweetening agent, and a chair that fails at precisely the moment when its occupant is animated enough to gesture expansively with his teacup." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. One might almost think that someone with intimate knowledge of Mr. Pargeter's habits had arranged matters to ensure a very specific sequence of events. The silence that followed this statement was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of evening birds in the garden beyond the windows. Chapter 4. The Speaking Tube. The growing dusk had prompted Mrs. Glade to switch on the electric lamps, casting pools of warm light throughout the drawing-room. Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the curious apparatus that had provided such innocent amusement earlier in the afternoon, the old speaking tube that connected the parlour to the pantry below. "Such a charming relic of bygone days," she remarked to Lady Bantry, who had settled herself with resigned patience in a nearby chair. "I confess I have always been fascinated by these domestic conveniences that our grandparents took for granted." The speaking tube was indeed a fine example of Victorian ingenuity. Its brass mouth, polished to a gentle gleam, was set into the wall at a convenient height for communication between the rooms. What caught Miss Marple's attention, however, was the makeshift paper funnel that still protruded from the opening like an oversized ear trumpet. "Betty," she called gently to the serving girl, "you mentioned earlier that you had tested this speaking tube. Might I ask you to demonstrate how it works?" The rosy-cheeked girl approached with obvious pleasure at being asked to show off the afternoon's discovery. "Oh yes, miss, it's ever so clever. You see, I made this funnel from some writing paper, to make the voices carry better." She indicated the cone of paper that had been carefully inserted into the parlour end of the tube. "If you speak into it here, whoever's in the pantry below can hear every word clear as day." Inspector Slack, who had been making notes in his official manner, looked up with mild interest. "Ingenious bit of engineering, I'll grant you. Though I can't see what bearing it has on the unfortunate accident." Miss Marple's response was to approach the speaking tube more closely, her keen eyes examining the paper funnel with the sort of attention one might give to a rare botanical specimen. "Most interesting construction, Betty. You say you made this from writing paper?" "Yes, miss. There was some lovely thick paper in the writing desk, perfect for the purpose." "And the tube itself functions perfectly well?" Betty nodded enthusiastically. "Mrs. Glade said we might use it to pass along the pledge news if the room grew too noisy. Much more fun than simply calling across the parlour." Miss Marple carefully removed the paper funnel, examining both it and the brass opening it had occupied. Her expression grew thoughtful as she peered into the tube itself, then bent to sniff delicately at the opening. "Lady Bantry," she said quietly, "would you be so kind as to accompany me to the pantry? I believe we should examine the other end of this communication system." The pantry proved to be a model of domestic efficiency, with gleaming copper pots arranged on well-scrubbed shelves and everything in its proper place. Hilda Sims had clearly maintained the highest standards, even in the utility areas of the house. The speaking tube emerged from the wall at chest height, its brass mouth darkened slightly with age but still functional. Miss Marple approached it with the same careful attention she had devoted to the parlour end. Almost immediately she made a small sound of discovery. "How very illuminating," she murmured, indicating a faint smear around the rim of the tube opening. "Lady Bantry, what would you make of this mark here?" Dolly Bantry adjusted her spectacles and peered closely at the indicated spot. "It looks rather like rouge, or perhaps lip salve. Someone has been speaking quite close to the opening." "Precisely my thought. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the shelf directly below the speaking tube, where her sharp eyes had detected something that glittered faintly in the electric light. "And what have we here?" Resting on the shelf was a length of ordinary kitchen string, perhaps 6 inches long, but dusted with what appeared to be fine white powder. Miss Marple picked it up carefully, holding it to the light for closer examination. "Sugar again," she announced with quiet satisfaction. "Powdered this time rather than the granulated crystals we found upstairs." They returned to the drawing room to find Inspector Slack in earnest conversation with Maurice Dean about the structural integrity of Victorian furniture. The inspector looked up as the ladies entered, his expression suggesting a man hoping for reassurance that his simple case would remain simple. "Find anything of interest in the pantry?" he inquired with forced casualness. "Indeed we did," replied Miss Marple, displaying the sugar-dusted string. This was resting on the shelf beneath the speaking tube. Most curious, particularly when one considers the lip rouge on the tube opening itself. Mrs. Glade, who had been sitting quietly with her needlework, looked up with obvious bewilderment. "I cannot imagine how such things came to be there. Hilda keeps that pantry spotless." Hilda Sims, summoned from the kitchen where she had been washing the tea things, examined the string with professional disapproval. "That's not mine, I can tell you that much. I use proper kitchen twine, and I certainly don't dust it with sugar." "No, I quite believe you don't," agreed Miss Marple gently. "But someone clearly found it useful for some purpose. The question is, what purpose exactly?" She returned to the speaking tube, this time addressing the assembled company through it in demonstration. Her voice emerged clearly from the pantry below, confirming the system's excellent acoustics. "Remarkable clarity," observed Dr. Haydock. "One could easily conduct a conversation between the 2 rooms." "Or," suggested Miss Marple with deceptive mildness, "one could time a whisper to coincide with a particular moment upstairs. For instance, if someone in the pantry wished to ensure that exciting news was shared at precisely the right instant." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Inspector Slack's notebook remained poised, but his pen had stopped moving as he considered the ramifications of this observation. "You're suggesting," he said slowly, "that someone deliberately timed the announcement about Major West's pledge." "I am suggesting nothing more than that the timing was remarkably convenient," Miss Marple replied. Mr. Pargeter leaned back to share in the laughter at precisely the moment when his chair was most likely to fail. One might call it coincidence, or one might consider other possibilities. Mrs. Trent, who had been following the conversation with growing alarm, clutched her pledge sheets more tightly. "But surely you cannot mean that someone intended for poor Lionel to fall?" "That would be monstrous." "Intentions can be difficult to determine," Miss Marple observed, "but preparations often leave traces for those who know how to look for them." She held up the sugar-dusted string once more, her eyes moving from face to face among the assembled company. "This little piece of twine, for instance, suggests that someone took considerable trouble to ensure that sugar would be available at the crucial moment. The question we must ask ourselves is, why would anyone need to have sugar so readily at hand in the pantry when all the tea service was conducted in the parlour above?" The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle ticking of the mantel clock and the whisper of wind in the chimney. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and the cosy domesticity of the afternoon tea seemed very far away indeed. Chapter 5. 2 teaspoons. The evening had settled properly over St. Mary Mead by the time Miss Marple turned her attention to what might have seemed, to a less observant eye, the most trivial detail of all. The delicate china saucer that had accompanied Mr. Pargeter's final cup of tea sat upon the sideboard where Hilda had carefully placed it, still bearing its burden of 2 silver teaspoons. "Mrs. Glade," Miss Marple began with the gentle persistence that had served her so well over the years, "I wonder if you might help me understand the sequence of events regarding Mr. Pargeter's refreshments. You mentioned that he was quite particular about certain matters." Mrs. Glade looked up from her embroidery, her face still bearing the pallor of shock, but her composure gradually returning. "Poor Lionel was indeed rather set in his ways. He had very definite preferences about how things should be done." "And his tea service?" I understand he took no sugar due to medical advice. That's correct. Dr. Haydock had been most emphatic about his dietary restrictions following a bout of digestive troubles last winter. Lionel was quite conscientious about following instructions, though he did complain about missing his customary sweetening. Lady Bantry, who had known the deceased for many years through various village committees, nodded in confirmation. Lionel was always grumbling good-naturedly about his bland diet. He used to joke that life had lost much of its savour since the doctor banned sugar from his tea. Miss Marple approached the sideboard where the evidence of Mr. Pargeta's last tea remained undisturbed. The fine bone china cup bore the faint brown stain of its contents, while the saucer displayed those 2 puzzling teaspoons with unmistakable clarity. "Mrs. Trent," she continued, "you mentioned earlier that you provided the second spoon when serving Mr. Pargeta his additional scone. Might I ask you to recall the exact circumstances?" Dulcie Trent consulted her memory with the same methodical precision she brought to her treasurer's duties. Certainly. Lionel had finished his first scone and asked for another. When I brought it to him, along with the jam pot, I naturally provided a fresh spoon for the preserves. He was most particular about not using the same implement for different purposes. "A commendable habit," observed Dr. Haydock. "Proper hygiene in such matters prevents the spread of various ailments." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple. "And yet I find myself wondering about the timing of the second service. When exactly did Mr. Pargeta request his additional refreshment?" Mrs. Trent's brow furrowed slightly as she considered the question. "It would have been shortly before the accident, I believe. Perhaps 5 or 10 minutes prior. He had been discussing the progress of the appeal fund with considerable animation, gesticulating rather freely as was his habit when enthusiastic about a subject." "Ah, yes, his habit of gesturing," Miss Marple mused, lifting the teacup to examine it more closely. "Mrs. Glade, you mentioned that Mr. Pargeta waved his cup about while making his point about pledge secrecy. Could you describe exactly how he held it?" "Well, he was right-handed, of course, so he held the cup in his right hand. When he became excited about something, he would wave it about rather dramatically. It was one of his little mannerisms." Mrs. Glade's voice caught slightly as she spoke of the deceased's habits. Miss Marple turned the cup slowly in her hands, studying the rim where Mr. Pargeta's lips had last touched the china. In the electric light something caught her attention, a faint crystalline residue that sparkled like frost along the edge. "Lady Bantry, would you be so kind as to look at this cup rim? Tell me what you observe." Dolly Bantry rose from her chair and examined the indicated area with growing puzzlement. "There appears to be some sort of granular substance adhering to the china, rather like sugar crystals, but surely that cannot be correct." "My thoughts exactly," replied Miss Marple. "If Mr. Pargeta took no sugar in his tea, how do we account for this evidence of sweetening?" Inspector Slack, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the investigation, cleared his throat officiously. "Could be anything, really. Perhaps some sugar from an earlier cup, or contamination from the jam pot." "An interesting theory," Miss Marple acknowledged. "However, Hilda, you did wash and dry this cup specifically for Mr. Pargeta's use, did you not?" "Indeed I did, miss. I always ensure that special guests receive the finest service. That cup was spotless when I filled it with tea, and the jam pot remained sealed until Mrs. Trent opened it for the scones." "Yes, miss. Everything was prepared fresh this afternoon." Miss Marple set down the cup and picked up one of the teaspoons, holding it to the light. Like the cup rim, it bore traces of the same crystalline residue, but there was something more, a faint stickiness that suggested the presence of some binding agent. "Most curious," she murmured. "This spoon shows evidence of having been used to stir something considerably sweeter than unsweetened tea. The residue has an almost syrupy quality." She turned to address the assembled company with the air of a teacher presenting a particularly interesting problem to her students. "We have established that Mr. Pargeta took no sugar in his tea, yet we find sugar crystals on both his cup and his stirring spoon. We know that he was in the habit of stirring twice, even when his tea contained no sweetening, and we have observed that he spilled some of this supposedly sugarless tea at precisely the moment when his chair was most vulnerable to failure. The implications of these observations settled over the room like evening mist. Mrs. Glade's needlework had fallen forgotten into her lap, while Maurice Dean shifted uncomfortably in his seat near the fireplace. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" asked Dr. Haydock, though his tone suggested he was beginning to anticipate her answer. "I am suggesting that Mr. Pargita's final cup of tea contained considerably more than he realised," she replied calmly. "Someone had sweetened it without his knowledge, despite his medical restrictions and stated preferences." Mrs. Trent leaned forward with obvious concern. But who would do such a thing? And why? Surely a little sugar, even against medical advice, could hardly be considered dangerous. Perhaps not dangerous in itself, Miss Marple agreed. But if one wished to ensure that a hot, sticky liquid would be spilled at exactly the right moment, and in precisely the correct location, then yes, additional sweetening might serve a very specific purpose indeed. She paused, allowing her words to register fully before continuing. "You see, if someone had dissolved a considerable quantity of sugar in Mr. Pargita's tea, and if that same person had arranged for him to spill this sweetened liquid at a predetermined moment, then the sugar would serve as a most effective solvent for other substances that might have been strategically placed to dissolve when exposed to hot, sweet liquid." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft hiss of the gas fire and the distant sound of evening birds settling for the night. In that silence, the true nature of the afternoon's tragedy began to emerge from the shadows of what had seemed like simple misfortune. Chapter 6. The Leg with a Sore Mark. The gravity of Miss Marple's implications had settled upon the drawing-room like a physical weight. Inspector Slack found himself staring at the broken chair leg with new eyes, his earlier certainty about the accidental nature of the tragedy beginning to crumble like poorly mixed mortar. "Mr. Dean," Miss Marple said with deceptive gentleness, "as our local expert on furniture construction, perhaps you would be so kind as to examine this chair leg once more. I should very much value your professional opinion on certain details." Maurice Dean rose from his position near the fireplace with what might have been reluctance, though he attempted to mask it with professional enthusiasm. "Certainly, Miss Marple. Though I must say I've already given it a thorough examination." "Indeed you have," she agreed pleasantly, "but I wonder if you might hold it steady while I look at it through this magnifying glass. These old eyes aren't quite what they once were." She produced a small but powerful magnifying glass from her reticule, the sort of implement that any dedicated needlewoman might carry for examining fine stitches. Dean took the detached leg in his hands, his craftsman's fingers automatically finding the proper grip to support its weight. Under the enhanced vision provided by the lens, details invisible to the naked eye began to emerge. Miss Marple moved the glass slowly along the break, her expression growing increasingly thoughtful as she studied the wood grain and the nature of the separation. "Most illuminating," she murmured. "Lady Bantry, would you care to look at this? I believe you'll find it quite educational." Dolly Bantry accepted the magnifying glass with curiosity, peering through it at the indicated area. "Good heavens, Jane, that doesn't look like the sort of break one would expect from old glue failure at all." "What exactly do you observe?" Miss Marple inquired with the patience of a teacher guiding a student toward discovery. "Well, the wood itself appears to have been cut. There's a perfectly straight line here, as clean as if someone had drawn it with a ruler. And the surface, it's far too smooth for a natural break." Inspector Slack moved closer, his official interest now thoroughly aroused. "Let me have a look at that." The magnifying glass passed from hand to hand, each observer adding their own exclamation of surprise as the true nature of the break became apparent under magnification. "That's a saw mark, sure as I'm standing here," declared Dr. Haydock with professional certainty. "Clean, straight, and recent by the look of it." Maurice Dean's face had grown considerably paler during this examination. That is to say, there might be an explanation. Sometimes when old joints fail, they can create very clean breaks." "Indeed they can," agreed Miss Marple mildly. "However, this particular mark shows characteristics that are quite distinctive, The kerf is straight and modern, not the irregular pattern one would expect from age-related failure. And she turned her attention to the mortise socket where the tenon had been seated, requesting that Dean angle it toward the light. Within the hollow cavity, something glittered with crystalline brightness. How very interesting, she observed, extending one finger to touch the interior of the socket. When she withdrew it, several clear angular crystals adhered to her fingertip. More sugar, but of a different character than what we found elsewhere. She brought her finger close to her nose and sniffed delicately. And unless I am very much mistaken, there's a distinct aroma of molasses, most peculiar for a chair joint that should contain nothing but old glue and wood dust. The assembled company watched in fascination as Miss Marple continued her examination. Her movements were methodical and precise, each observation building upon the last to create a picture that was becoming increasingly clear. "Mr. Dean," she continued, "in your professional experience would you expect to find sugar crystals inside a properly constructed mortise and tenon joint?" Dean's response came with noticeable hesitation. "Well, no, certainly not under normal circumstances, though there might be various explanations for such a thing." "I'm sure there might be," Miss Marple replied with gentle irony. "However, when combined with the evidence of deliberate cutting, these crystals suggest a rather specific explanation. Someone has used sugar as a temporary fastening agent." She paused to allow this revelation to register before continuing. "You see, if one were to fill a loosened joint with hard sugar lumps, perhaps mixed with a small amount of molasses for adhesion, the joint would appear sound and would bear normal weight. However, when exposed to hot, sweet liquid, the sugar would dissolve, causing the joint to fail at exactly the moment when stress was applied." The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Glade's embroidery hoop had fallen from nerveless fingers, while Mrs. Trent clutched her pledge sheets as if they were a lifeline in stormy seas. "Are you saying," Inspector Slack asked slowly, "that someone deliberately sabotaged this chair?" "I am saying that the evidence suggests careful preparation and precise timing," Miss Marple replied. "The chair joint was opened with a saw, filled with sugar props, and positioned so that when Mr. Pargeter's sweetened tea was spilled at the crucial moment, the resulting dissolution would cause catastrophic failure." Maurice Dean set down the chair leg with hands that trembled slightly. "Miss Marple, surely you cannot believe that I would be party to such a thing. I've been repairing furniture in this village for 30 years. "I make no accusations, Mr. Dean," she assured him calmly. "I merely observe that this work required considerable skill with woodworking tools and intimate knowledge of furniture construction. The saw cut is expertly placed to weaken the joint without making the damage immediately visible." Dr. Haydock examined the chair leg once more, his medical training lending authority to his observations. "The precision is remarkable. This wasn't the work of an amateur. Someone with considerable expertise planned and executed this modification." "But the question remains," added Lady Bantry, "who had both the skill and the opportunity to prepare such an elaborate device?" Miss Marple's eyes moved thoughtfully from face to face among the assembled company. "Indeed, that is the question we must answer. Who possessed the necessary knowledge, had access to the chair beforehand, and could coordinate the timing of events with such deadly precision?" Outside, the evening had deepened into full night, and the cosy warmth of the drawing-room seemed suddenly less comforting. The revelation that Mr. Pargeter's death had been carefully orchestrated rather than accidental cast every shadow in a more sinister light. "What I find most remarkable," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully, "is the elegance of the method. Using sugar as both a temporary adhesive and its own destruction mechanism shows a mind that appreciates the poetic justice of sweet things becoming instruments of dissolution." The phrase hung in the air like an epitaph, while outside the windows of Rosebank Cottage, the darkness pressed close against the glass. Chapter 7, Ants by the Hearth. The revelation of deliberate sabotage had cast a pall of unease over the assembled company, but it was Lady Bantry who first noticed the small disturbance that would provide yet another piece of the puzzle. She had risen from her chair to warm her hands by the fire when her attention was caught by an unexpected movement near the brass fender. How very odd, she remarked, bending down for a closer look. Jane, there appear to be ants investigating the hearth area, 3 of them moving about with considerable purpose. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and joined her friend beside the fireplace. Indeed, several industrious ants were making their way along the skirting board, their antennae waving as they explored the territory with the methodical thoroughness of their species. Most curious, she observed, watching their progress with keen interest. Ants are not typically found indoors at this time of year, particularly not in such well-maintained households. Hilda Sims, who took considerable pride in the cleanliness of her domain, looked up from her position near the sideboard with obvious concern. "I do beg your pardon, Miss Marple. I noticed those creatures this morning and treated the area with borax powder. I cannot imagine how they've returned so quickly." "You saw them this morning?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. "Before the tea party began?" "Yes, miss. Just after breakfast, when I was doing my morning cleaning. 3 or 4 of them, nosing about the skirting board exactly where they are now. I dusted the area thoroughly with borax, which usually discourages such intrusions permanently. Inspector Slack, whose understanding of the case had been thoroughly revised over the past hour, approached the hearth with renewed attention to detail. Persistent little beggars, aren't they? What would bring them back so soon after being poisoned? "That depends entirely upon what attracts them," replied Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Hilda, in your experience, what sorts of substances typically draw ants into a house?" The maid considered the question with professional thoroughness. "Crumbs mostly, miss. Sweet things, jam spills, sugar that's been dropped. They're terrible ones for anything sugary. Ants are." "Precisely my understanding," agreed Miss Marple. "They have no interest whatsoever in old hide glue or wood polish, but they will travel considerable distances for even the smallest trace of sweetness." She knelt beside the skirting board, her movements careful despite the protest of elderly joints. The ants were indeed concentrated in a specific area, their activity focused on the exact spot where the broken chair had stood and where the crystallized sugar residue had been discovered. "Lady Bantry, would you observe their behaviour? They are not wandering randomly, but following a very definite trail." Dolly Bantry crouched beside her friend, watching as the tiny insects moved with purposeful determination along the base of the wall. "You're absolutely right, Jane. They're following some sort of scent that leads directly to where that sticky spillage occurred." Dr. Haydock, whose medical training included a basic understanding of natural history, nodded approvingly. Ants lay down chemical trails to guide their fellows to food sources. If they detected sugar in this location, they would mark the path for future reference. "But surely," interjected Mrs. Glade with obvious distress, "the presence of a few ants cannot be significant. These old houses are prone to such minor intrusions." Miss Marple rose from her examination of the insects, her expression thoughtful. "On the contrary, Mrs. Glade, I believe these small visitors provide quite valuable testimony. You see, they confirm that sugar was present in this location well before Mr. Pargetter's accident occurred. The implications of this observation settled over the room like a chill draught. If ants had been attracted to the area in the morning, it suggested that the sugary substance had been placed there during the early preparation for the tea party. "Hilda," Miss Marple continued gently, "when you cleaned this morning and discovered the ants, did you notice anything else unusual? Any residue or stickiness that might have attracted them?" The maid's brow furrowed with concentration. "Now that you mention it, miss, there was a certain tackiness to the skirting board right where they were congregating. I thought perhaps one of the young ladies had spilled something while helping with yesterday's arrangements, so I cleaned it thoroughly." "And yet they returned," observed Inspector Slack with growing understanding, "which suggests that whatever attracted them was replenished some time after your morning cleaning." "Exactly," agreed Miss Marple. "The ants we observe now are following a trail that was established after Hilda's borax treatment. Someone reapplied the attractive substance during the course of the day." Maurice Dean, who had grown increasingly silent during these revelations, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Surely you're reading too much into the behaviour of a few insects." "There could be any number of explanations for their presence." "Indeed there could," Miss Marple acknowledged pleasantly. "However, When combined with all our other observations, these small witnesses help to establish a very clear timeline. Someone prepared the chair joint with sugar-based adhesive, someone sweetened Mr. Pargita's tea without his knowledge, and someone ensured that a trail of attractive sweetness would guide our tiny friends to the exact location where the crucial evidence would be found. She paused, watching as one particularly determined ant investigated the area where the chair leg had rested. What strikes me as most remarkable is the thoroughness of the preparation. Even the smallest details were anticipated and arranged. Lady Bantry stood up, brushing dust from her purple tweed with automatic efficiency. It suggests a mind that thinks in terms of complete systems rather than isolated actions. Precisely, agreed Miss Marple. Someone who understands that true success requires attention to every element, no matter how seemingly insignificant. The ants continued their methodical exploration, oblivious to the human drama unfolding around them. Their simple pursuit of sweetness had unwittingly provided testimony to a much more complex and sinister design. "Inspector Slack," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe these small witnesses have told us something quite important about the timing of our mystery. The sugar trail they follow was established today, during the hours when our suspects were preparing for this afternoon's gathering." The inspector made careful notes in his official book. His earlier dismissal of the case's complexities now replaced by grudging respect for Miss Marple's methods of observation. "Right then," he said grimly, "if someone was laying sugar trails this morning, we need to establish exactly who had access to this room during the preparation period." Outside, the night had settled completely over St. Mary Mead, but inside Rosebank Cottage, the patient work of unravelling a carefully constructed crime continued under the warm glow of electric lamps. Chapter 8, The Fender Moved an Inch. The discovery of the ants and their testimony to deliberate preparation had brought a new solemnity to the gathering in Mrs. Glade's drawing-room. As the evening deepened and the implications of murder began to crystallise, Miss Marple found her attention drawn once more to the physical arrangement of the scene itself. "Mrs. Glade," she began with characteristic gentleness, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity about your household arrangements. This is such a beautifully appointed room, and I confess I am always interested in how people choose to position their furniture." Mrs. Glade looked up from her needlework with an expression that mingled grief with bewilderment. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I do try to keep everything pleasant and welcoming, though I'm afraid I cannot see how such matters could possibly be relevant to poor Lionel's accident." "Oh, but arrangement is everything in domestic life," Miss Marple replied, with the enthusiasm of one discussing a favourite subject. "The placement of each piece tells such a story about the habits and preferences of the household. This brass fender, for instance, is positioned with such precision before the hearth." She approached the gleaming brass guard that surrounded the fireplace, her observant eyes taking in every detail of its construction and placement. The fender was a handsome piece, clearly well maintained and properly proportioned for the room's dimensions. "A beautiful example of Victorian craftsmanship," she continued, running her hand along its polished surface, "and positioned exactly where one would expect for both safety and aesthetics. Or is it?" Lady Bantry, who had known Miss Marple long enough to recognise when her friend was following a particular line of reasoning, moved closer to examine the fender herself. "What do you mean, Jane? It looks perfectly normal to me." Miss Marple's response was to kneel beside the brass guard, her fingertips exploring its base where it met the hearthrug. In the electric light, something caught her attention. A faint smear along the inner left corner, as if the metal had been polished recently but not quite thoroughly enough. "Most interesting," she murmured, pointing out the mark to her friend. "This Polish smear suggests recent handling, yet Hilda maintains such high standards that I cannot imagine her leaving such work incomplete." Hilda Sims, summoned from her clearing duties, examined the indicated spot with professional interest. "That's most peculiar, miss. I polish the fender every Wednesday without fail, and I always ensure a perfect finish. I certainly didn't leave any smears yesterday." "I'm sure you didn't," agreed Miss Marple soothingly. "Which suggests that someone else has moved this fender since your last cleaning. Perhaps this morning, during the preparations for the tea party." She turned her attention to the carpet beneath and around the brass guard, her sharp eyes detecting subtle signs that others might have missed entirely. The thick pile showed a faint but distinct pattern of compression, as if something heavy had been dragged across it in a particular direction. "Lady Bantry, would you be so kind as to help me examine this carpet? I believe we shall find it quite revealing." Together the two elderly ladies traced the nearly invisible marks in the carpet pile. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew how to read such signs, a clear indication that the fender had been moved from its original position. "Mrs. Glade," Miss Marple said, straightening with some difficulty, "did you perhaps adjust the position of this fender today? Perhaps to better accommodate the hearthrug or to improve the room's appearance for your guests?" Mrs. Glade's response came with a slight hesitation that did not escape notice. "Well, yes, I did make some small adjustments this morning. One does like everything to be perfect when entertaining, doesn't one? I thought the fender needed to be positioned more precisely to complement the new arrangement." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed warmly. "A hostess's attention to detail is always commendable. Might I ask in which direction you moved it?" "Oh, just a small adjustment inward toward the hearth. An inch or so, nothing more. I wanted to ensure that the hearthrug lay properly beneath it." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful as she considered this information. She moved to where the broken chair had stood, positioning herself approximately where Mr. Pargeter would have been seated. From this vantage point she studied the angle and distance to the brass fender, with the sort of calculation that might have seemed more appropriate to a surveyor than an elderly spinster. "Most illuminating," she observed. "Inspector Slack, might I ask you to assist me with a small experiment? If you would be so kind as to position yourself in this chair, as Mr. Pargeter was seated, and then lean backward as he did when sharing in the laughter about Major West's pledge." The inspector, though clearly puzzled by the request, complied with good grace. He settled himself in the remaining dining chair that most closely matched the proportions of the broken balloon-back piece, then leaned backward at approximately the angle that witnesses had described. "Now," Miss Marple continued, "if you were to fall backward from that position with sufficient force to strike your head, where exactly would you land?" Inspector Slack considered the trajectory carefully, his police training giving him a practical understanding of such matters. "Well, given the angle and the momentum, I'd say the head would strike somewhere along the inner edge of that fender, right about here." He indicated a specific point on the brass guard's inner left corner. "Precisely where we found the Polish smear," Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction, "and precisely where poor Mr. Pargeter's temple made contact with the metal. What remarkable precision in the placement." The implications of this observation settled over the assembled company like a heavy blanket. Dr. Haydock, whose medical examination had established the cause of death, nodded slowly as the significance became clear. "You're suggesting that the fender was moved deliberately to ensure that it would be in exactly the right position to cause fatal injury when the chair failed?" "I am suggesting that someone with intimate knowledge of Mr. Pargeter's seating habits and physical dimensions calculated exactly where he would fall, then positioned the fender accordingly," Miss Marple replied calmly. "A difference of even a few inches might have resulted in a bruising fall rather than a fatal blow." Mrs. Trent clutched her pledge sheets more tightly, her face pale in the lamplight, but that would mean someone planned not merely to frighten or embarrass poor Lionel, but to kill him outright. "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple gravely. "The precision of the arrangement suggests that death, not mere injury, was the intended outcome. Someone took considerable care to ensure that when the chair failed, the consequences would be fatal." She paused, allowing her words to register fully before continuing. This was not a crime of passion or sudden impulse, but a carefully orchestrated execution disguised as domestic accident. Every element was calculated to achieve a specific result. Maurice Dean, who had grown increasingly silent during these revelations, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Miss Marple, surely you cannot believe that anyone in this room could be capable of such cold-blooded planning?" "I believe," she replied with gentle firmness, "that someone present this afternoon possesses both the knowledge and the opportunity to arrange Mr. Pargeter's death with meticulous precision. The question we must answer is, who among us had reason to want Lionel Pargeter dead, and who possessed the skills necessary to execute such an elaborate plan? Outside the windows of Rosebank Cottage, the night pressed close against the glass, while inside, the warm circle of lamplight seemed to grow smaller and more intimate as the net of evidence drew tighter around the assembled suspects. Chapter 9. Sticky String in the Drawer. The revelation that the fender had been positioned with lethal precision had cast an atmosphere of considerable tension over the drawing room. Miss Marple, however, seemed to draw energy from the growing complexity of the case, her bright eyes moving about the room with the systematic attention of one who had learned that the most significant clues often hid in the most mundane locations. "Mrs. Glade," she said with a sort of gentle persistence that brooked no refusal, "I wonder if I might trouble you to examine the contents of your sideboard. In my experience, such pieces of furniture often contain the most fascinating collections of domestic necessities." Mrs. Glade rose from her chair with obvious reluctance, her composure beginning to show the strain of the evening's revelations. "Certainly, Miss Marple, though I cannot imagine what you might hope to find there. It contains only the usual household items, serving pieces, linens, and various odds and ends." The mahogany sideboard was indeed a handsome piece, its polished surface reflecting the warm glow of the electric lamps. Mrs. Glade opened the upper drawer with hands that trembled slightly, revealing the sort of carefully organised collection that spoke of a methodical domestic mind. Miss Marple approached the open drawer with the reverent attention of an archaeologist examining ancient artefacts. Her experienced eyes took in the neat arrangements of silver serving spoons, crisp linen napkins, and the various small implements that make civilized entertaining possible. "Such beautiful organisation," she commented admiringly. "Everything in its proper place, and a place for everything. You have clearly mastered the art of household management." But even as she spoke, her fingers were exploring the corners and recesses of the drawer with practised thoroughness. It was in the back left corner, tucked beneath a stack of embroidered doilies, that she discovered what she had been seeking. "How very interesting," she murmured, withdrawing a short length of kitchen twine, perhaps 4 inches long, that bore unmistakable signs of recent use. The string was ordinary enough in appearance, but closer examination revealed that it had been rubbed or coated with some sticky substance that caught the light with crystalline clarity. Lady Bantry moved closer to examine the discovery. "Good heavens, Jane, that looks exactly like the sugar-dusted string we found in the pantry. What on earth would such a thing be doing in Mrs. Glade's sideboard?" "An excellent question," replied Miss Marple, holding the string to the light for better examination. "The sticky coating appears to be sugar paste of some sort, mixed with what I suspect is molasses or treacle. Quite deliberate preparation, wouldn't you say?" She continued her exploration of the drawer's contents, her careful fingers detecting other items that seemed out of place in such an orderly domestic collection. Beneath a silver butter knife, she discovered a small paring knife whose edge bore fresh scrape marks along its blade. "Most curious," she observed, holding the knife where others could see the telltale scratches. "This blade has been used recently for something considerably harder than fruit or vegetables. The scrape pattern suggests contact with wood, and fairly hard wood at that." Inspector Slack, who had been taking increasingly detailed notes throughout the evening's discoveries, approached the sideboard with official interest. "May I examine that knife, Miss Marple?" Under the inspector's scrutiny, the evidence became even more damning. The blade showed clear signs of having been used to pry or scrape at something unyielding, while tiny wood particles adhered to the metal near the handle. "This knife has definitely been used on wood quite recently," he announced with professional certainty. "The scratches are fresh, and there are definite wood shavings embedded in the metal." Miss Marple's exploration had revealed one final piece of evidence, a small paper cone, cleverly fashioned from writing paper, and tucked beneath the corner of a lace runner. The cone was of the sort that might be used for pouring small quantities of granulated substances with precision. "A funnel," observed Dr. Haydock, examining the paper construction, "designed for pouring sugar or similar materials into confined spaces." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple, "and when combined with our other discoveries, It suggests a very specific sequence of preparation activities. Someone used this knife to open the chair joint, employed the paper cone to pour sugar crystals into the cavity, and utilised the prepared string for some aspect of the operation. Mrs. Glade had grown progressively paler during these revelations. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap as the implications became increasingly clear. "I cannot imagine how such things came to be in my drawer," she said with failing conviction. "Perhaps one of the servants—" "Hilda," Miss Marple called gently to the maid, "have you ever seen these items before? The string, the knife with wood scrapes, the paper funnel?" Hilda Sims examined each piece with the careful attention of one who knew every implement in the household. "The string isn't mine, miss, and I've never seen that paper cone before. As for the knife, I use the paring knives for kitchen work, but I'd never scrape wood with good steel. Ruins the edge something dreadful." "Of course it does," agreed Miss Marple warmly. "A skilled housekeeper would never abuse good cutlery in such a fashion, which suggests that these implements were prepared by someone with a different purpose entirely." She turned her attention to Mrs. Trent, who had been following the discoveries with obvious distress. "Mrs. Trent, you mentioned earlier that you had written to Mr. Pargeter about some matter concerning the WI funds. Might I ask the nature of your correspondence?" Dulcie Trent's face flushed with embarrassment as she consulted her memory. It was regarding an audit query that had arisen. Lionel had been holding certain WI funds on account pending some investment decisions, and there had been questions raised about the proper documentation. Questions of a serious nature? Well, yes, I'm afraid so. The county inspector had requested a full accounting, and there were some discrepancies that needed explanation. I wrote to Lionel asking for clarification before the matter became awkward. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did Mr. Pargeter respond to your inquiry?" "He telephoned yesterday evening, actually. Said he would explain everything at today's meeting, but that certain parties needed to be more amenable to reasonable arrangements if they wished to avoid unpleasant publicity. The implications of this revelation settled over the assembled company like a physical weight." Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with growing understanding. "Are you saying that Pargeter was threatening someone with financial scandal?" "I am saying," Mrs. Trent replied carefully, "that Lionel could be quite forceful when he believed his position gave him leverage over others. He hinted that some irregularities might be overlooked if certain accommodations were made." Miss Marple's attention had returned to the contents of the sideboard drawer, her fingers exploring one final corner where something had caught her notice. She withdrew what appeared to be a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and bearing the unmistakable format of a promissory note. "Most illuminating," she murmured, scanning the document's contents. "It appears that Mr. Pargeter's influence extended beyond mere WI funds into more personal financial arrangements." The paper bore Maurice Dean's signature, along with Mrs. Glade's name as guarantor, and represented a substantial sum that had been borrowed against the promise of furniture restoration services and property improvements. "The web grows ever more complex," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Financial pressure, professional leverage, and personal vulnerability all converging around poor Mr. Pargeter. One might almost say that several people had reason to wish him permanently silenced." Outside, the night wind had begun to stir the trees round Rosebank Cottage, their branches tapping against the windows like ghostly fingers seeking entry to the warm, lamp-lit room where the truth was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows of deception. Chapter 10. Evensong Who Sweetened the Joint. The clock on the mantelpiece of the Reverend Clement's sitting room chimed the half-hour as Miss Marple settled herself comfortably in the familiar chintz armchair that had become her customary seat during such discussions. The events at Rosebank Cottage had concluded with Inspector Slack's formal request that all parties present themselves at the vicarage for what he termed clarification of certain matters. Griselda Clement bustled about with tea things, her youthful energy a sharp contrast to the gravity of the occasion. The Reverend Leonard Clement sat quietly in his worn leather chair, his scholarly demeanour lending an air of solemnity to the proceedings as the various participants in the afternoon's tragedy arranged themselves about the room. "Now then," began Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm, "I believe we have gathered sufficient evidence to understand exactly what transpired at Mrs. Glade's tea party. It was, I'm afraid, a most ingenious and carefully planned murder. Mrs. Glade sat rigidly upright on the sofa, her complexion ashen but her bearing still maintaining some semblance of dignity. Beside her, Maurice Dean appeared to have aged considerably since the afternoon, his craftsman's hands trembling slightly as they rested on his knees. The method employed was both novel and remarkably cruel in its precision, Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had served her so well over the years. Someone understood that Mr. Pargeter was a creature of very definite habits, and used those habits against him with deadly efficiency. She paused in her knitting to address the assembled company directly. You see, the murderer faced a particular challenge. How does one kill a man in a room full of witnesses while making it appear to be a tragic accident? The answer, it seems, lay in the very furniture upon which he sat. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook, though by now he had learned to follow Miss Marple's reasoning rather than attempt to direct it. You're referring to the sabotage chair, Miss Marple. Indeed I am, Inspector. But the sabotage was far more sophisticated than simple vandalism. Someone with considerable woodworking skill used a sharp saw to partially cut through the back left tenon of that balloon-back chair. The cut was positioned precisely to weaken the joint without making the damage immediately visible. She held up the sugar-dusted string that had been found in the pantry. This little piece of twine tells us how the joint was held together after being compromised. The murderer filled the loosened mortise with hard sugar lumps, using a small amount of molasses or treacle to help them adhere. Dry, this makeshift repair would bear normal weight and appear sound. Lady Bantry, who had insisted on accompanying her friend to witness the denouement, leaned forward with fascination. But how could the murderer be certain the chair would fail at exactly the right moment? Ah, replied Miss Marple with a slight smile, that required the second part of the plan. Someone secretly sweetened Mr. Pargeter's tea with a considerable quantity of dissolved sugar, despite his medical restrictions and known preferences. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. The sugar crystals we found on his cup and spoon confirm that theory. But surely he would have tasted the difference. Not necessarily, Doctor. If the sugar were added to tea that was already quite hot, and if Mr. Pargeter were distracted by conversation and social obligations, he might well consume several sips before noticing any difference. And by then, the plan would already be in motion. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm as she outlined the sequence of events. You see, Mr. Pargeter was known to gesture expansively with his teacup when animated by conversation. Someone who knew his habits well positioned his chair and the small side table so that when he became excited about Major West's pledge and leaned back to share in the laughter, he would naturally spill his sweetened tea. And the spilled tea would dissolve the sugar props holding the chair together, Inspector Slack concluded with growing understanding. Precisely. The hot sweet liquid ran down the chair rail and dissolved the sugar wedged into the joint. At the next backward lean, the compromised chair failed catastrophically, throwing Mr. Pargeter against the brass fender with fatal force. The Reverend Clement, who had been listening with the sort of grave attention he usually reserved for particularly complex theological discussions, stirred in his chair. But surely such an elaborate plan required considerable preparation and perfect timing. Indeed it did, agreed Miss Marple, which brings us to the question of who possessed both the necessary skills and the opportunity to execute such a scheme. Her bright eyes moved deliberately around the room, settling first on Maurice Dean. Mr. Dean certainly possessed the woodworking expertise to open and repair the chair joint with surgical precision. His workshop contained all the necessary tools, and his reputation gave him legitimate access to examine Mrs. Glade's furniture. Dean's face had grown haggard under the scrutiny. Miss Marple, I may have the skills you describe, but I would never use them for such a purpose. I've spent my life creating and repairing beautiful things, not destroying them. No, she agreed gently. I don't believe you were the primary architect of this crime, Mr. Dean. However, your financial difficulties and your attachment to Mrs. Glade made you vulnerable to her influence. She turned her attention to Mrs. Glade, whose composure was beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence. The true mastermind required intimate knowledge of Mr. Pargeter's habits, access to his tea service, and the ability to coordinate every element of the plan with perfect timing. Mrs. Glade knew that Mr. Pargeter always sat in the same chair when visiting her home. She knew he gestured with his right hand and would spill tea in a predictable pattern. She positioned both the chair and the fender with lethal precision. Miss Marple paused to extract the paper funnel from her reticule. This little device allowed her to pour sugar crystals into the prepared joint with accuracy. The paring knife with wood scrapes shows how she assisted Mr. Dean in opening the mortise, while the sticky string in her drawer demonstrates her direct participation in the preparation. But most tellingly, she continued, Mrs. Glade was the only person who could coordinate the timing through the speaking tube. From the pantry below, she whispered the news about Major West's pledge at precisely the moment when Mr. Pargeter's animated response would cause the fatal spill. Mrs. Glade's carefully maintained facade finally crumbled. "I never meant for him to die," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I only wanted to frighten him, to make him spill his tea and perhaps fall harmlessly. The chair must have been weaker than I thought." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied with gentle firmness, "the positioning of the fender shows that death was always the intended outcome. You moved it exactly 1 inch inward to ensure that Mr. Pargeter's head would strike the lethal edge when he fell." Inspector Slack rose from his chair with official gravity. "Rowena Glade, I arrest you for the murder of Lionel Pargeter. Maurice Dean, I arrest you as an accessory to murder." As the two were led away into the night, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with the calm satisfaction of work well done. "Sugar," Lady Bantry observed quietly. "Of all things to use as a murder weapon." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the lamplight. "Housekeeping is indeed a useful education, my dear Dolly. Sugar is remarkably obedient in its behaviour. It holds when solid, then melts when dissolved. Rather like some plans, I've always found. They appear quite sturdy until exposed to the proper solvent, and then they dissolve entirely, leaving only the evidence of their former existence.